In the beginning, there were no footprints, only dust that settled upon dust, only winds that carried nothing but their own breath across a world that did not yet know witness. The earth turned in its endless rotation. The sun rose and set. The seasons cycled through their ancient rhythms. But there was no one to mark the passing, no consciousness to note the changing, no mind to wonder about origins or destinations, or the meaning hidden in the patient movements of geological time. The world was full of life, forests that breathed and oceans that teemed and creatures that moved through landscapes that existed long before names could be attached to them. But consciousness, if it existed at all, was simple and immediate: the hunger of the hunting cat, the fear of the fleeing gazelle, the satisfaction of the drinking elephant. There was no past that could be remembered beyond immediate experience, no future that could be imagined beyond immediate need, no sense of self that could ask, "Who am I?" Or "Where did I come from?" Or "Where am I going?" But somewhere in the dim corridors of deep time, something stirred. Not consciousness, not yet, but the faint trembling that precedes consciousness: a reaching, a becoming, a movement toward something that had no name because names had not been born. In the warm valleys where shadow and sunlight first conspired to shape what would become us, where rivers carved channels through ancient rock and acacia trees, offered sparse shade beneath relentless African sun, something began to change. The apes that lived in these valleys were successful, had been successful for millions of years, living in the forest canopy where fruit grew abundant and danger stalked primarily on the ground below. They moved through three-dimensional space with grace that modern humans can barely imagine, swinging from branch to branch, calculating distances and trajectories with precision written into muscles and neurons, through generations of selection that favored those who moved well and eliminated those who fell. But the world was changing. The climate was shifting slowly, imperceptibly within any single lifetime. But across millennia, the change accumulated like interest in an ancient account. The forests were shrinking. Where once there had been continuous canopy stretching from horizon to horizon, now there were clearings. The savanna was expanding, grasslands pushing into territories that trees had once dominated, creating landscapes that were neither pure forest nor pure grassland, but were transition zones where different rules applied. Some apes stayed in the remaining forests, clinging to the old ways, the old territories, the old adaptations that had served their ancestors well. Some adapted to forest edges, becoming comfortable in the boundary zones between canopy and grass. And some, our ancestors, began spending more time on the ground, not because they chose to in any conscious sense, but because the ground became unavoidable, became the space they had to cross to reach the scattered tree islands that remained, became the new reality that required new adaptations. The descent was not sudden abandonment, but gradual exploration, tentative ventures that became more frequent, necessity that became adaptation, that became new way of life. Walking on the ground required different movement than moving through trees. In the canopy, arms and legs shared the work equally, all four limbs participating in locomotion and support. On the ground, the options narrowed. They could walk on all fours like modern gorillas and chimpanzees, resting weight on the knuckles of their hands. Or they could walk upright on two legs alone, freeing the hands entirely from the burden of locomotion. Somehow, mysteriously, gradually across hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors chose or were chosen by natural selection for upright walking. The choice was not obvious. Upright walking is slower than four-legged movement over short distances. Upright walking is less stable, requiring constant adjustments to maintain balance. Upright walking exposes vital organs in ways that four-legged posture protects against. The costs were real and immediate, but the benefits, though perhaps less immediately apparent, were profound. Walking upright freed the hands completely. Hands that no longer needed for locomotion could carry things, could carry food back to safer locations, rather than eating where food was found, could carry infants who could no longer cling to mother's body hair as it gradually disappeared in adaptation to heat stress, could eventually carry tools and weapons, and all the objects that would transform human capability. Walking upright raised the body higher above the ground. In the tall grasses of the savanna, height meant visibility, meant spotting predators before they were close enough to strike, meant seeing distant prey or distant water sources, meant surveillance advantage that could mean the difference between eating and being eaten, between drinking and dying of thirst. Walking upright reduced exposure to the overhead sun. An upright body presents less surface area to the sun directly above than a horizontal body does, reducing heat stress in an environment where shade was scarce and overheating was constant threat. The adaptation to heat included loss of body hair and increase in sweat glands, changes that made upright walking even more advantageous because the cooling system worked better on exposed skin. The transformation required wholesale reconstruction of the body. The spine curved into the distinctive S-shape that characterizes human posture, creating curves that balance weight over the hips and allow upright stance, without constant muscular effort. The pelvis broadened and shortened to support the weight of internal organs in upright position, to provide attachment points for muscles that stabilize upright walking, to create the basin that holds organs in place when gravity pulls them downward rather than distributing them horizontally, as in four-legged animals. The legs lengthened and straightened. The knee joint modified to lock when fully extended, allowing standing without constant muscular work. The ankle strengthened to support full body weight on single leg during the walking stride. The foot lost the grasping ability that serves tree dwellers and gained, instead, an arched structure that acts as spring, storing energy when the foot strikes ground and releasing it during push-off, making walking energetically efficient in ways that flat-footed walking cannot match. The skull balanced atop the spine rather than jutting forward from it, changing the entire structure of the neck and head, moving the foramen magnum, the hole through which spinal cord enters skull, to the base of the skull rather than to the back, allowing the head to balance rather than requiring muscles to hold it up against gravity's constant pull. But upright walking also created problems that our species still struggles with. The narrowed birth canal made childbirth difficult, and dangerous. Human birth is uniquely dangerous among primates, carries risks of death for both mother and infant that other ape births rarely face. The vulnerability to back problems became endemic. The human spine, under vertical loading, experiences stresses it did not evolve for, making back pain and disc problems common afflictions of bipedal life. The transformation took millions of years, was not sudden switch but gradual modification, so slow that no generation could perceive the change, even though across deep time the transformation was total. The earliest evidence of upright walking comes from around 7 million years ago, fragmentary fossils that suggest bipedal posture, but do not prove fully committed bipedalism. By 4 million years ago, creatures like Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, and her kind were walking upright regularly, though their bodies retained some adaptations for climbing that suggest they still spent time in trees, still maintained connection to the arboreal life that had shaped their ancestors. By 2 million years ago, with Homo erectus, the commitment to upright walking was complete. These were creatures built for walking and running on open ground, creatures whose bodies showed no significant adaptations for climbing, creatures who had fully descended from the canopy and fully embraced terrestrial life. The transition was finished. The apes that had once lived in trees were now ground dwellers, fully adapted to life on the savanna, walking upright through grasslands that stretched beyond every horizon. The mystery is not in the mechanics of walking, but in what the walking unmade and remade. The hands freed from locomotion could carry and craft and gesture toward meaning. The upright posture made possible the expansion of brain size that would follow in later species. Because the skull balanced atop spine could grow larger without creating impossible stresses on neck muscles. The energy efficiency of bipedal walking allowed ranging over larger territories, allowed migrations that would eventually carry humans out of Africa and across the entire world. We close in the amber light of ancient savanna, watching shadows lengthen as the first walkers move through grass that is taller than memory, shorter than prophecy. They walk not knowing that their walking will echo through millions of years, will be preserved in footprints turned to stone, will define a lineage that will eventually include us, we who walk the same way they walked, we who inherited the upright posture and the freed hands, and all the possibilities that the first uncertain steps created. The dust that remembered walking. The ground that held footprints. The first steps that echo still in every stride we take. The beginning that was not beginning but continuation of something older, becoming something new. The transformation that took millions of years and that continues still, because we are not finished product but are work in progress, are still evolving, are still becoming whatever humans will become. The walk continues. The dust settles. And in the settling, the memory persists, memory of the first walkers who stood upright in an ancient world and took the steps that led, eventually, to us. Before fire was captured, the night was absolute, a darkness so complete it devoured everything beyond arm's reach. A void where predators moved unseen, and cold pressed against skin like a pronouncement of mortality. The darkness was not mere absence of light, but was presence, was the fundamental state of the universe beyond the narrow cone of day, was the condition that ruled most of the earth most of the time, was the domain where human eyes went blind and human ears strained to hear the approach of danger that could not be seen. The night was terror. Not abstract fear, but immediate, visceral understanding that humans were vulnerable, that the big cats could see in darkness while humans could not, that the hyenas hunted in packs through the hours when humans huddled together hoping to survive until dawn. The night was cold, cold that penetrated to the bone in the hours before sunrise, cold that killed the young and the old and the weak, cold that made equatorial Africa feel like polar winter once the sun withdrew its warmth. But somewhere in the shrouded ages, A hand reached toward flame and did not withdraw. Perhaps lightning struck dry grass and left embers glowing red in the darkness. Perhaps volcanic flow cooled slowly enough that its edge could be approached, could be studied, could teach humans that fire could exist in controllable forms rather than only in the terrifying infernos of wildfire. Perhaps friction between wood and stone, repeated thousands of times for other purposes, revealed the heat hidden in matter itself, revealed that rapid motion creates warmth. That warmth becomes heat. That heat becomes spark. That spark can become flame if conditions are right. The discovery was not singular moment, but was repeated across generations, each time forgotten when the fire died and knowledge died with it, each time remembered again when circumstance and observation aligned. But gradually, mysteriously, the knowledge began to hold. Someone learned to feed fire. Someone learned to protect it from wind and rain. Someone learned to carry it embers wrapped in green leaves that would not burn, embers placed in hollowed wood, embers tended constantly, because letting them die meant returning to the terror of absolute night. We stand in the trembling circle of first controlled flame, watching faces illuminated by light that is not sunlight, not moonlight, but is human-made radiance pushing back the ancient dark. The faces show wonder and fear in equal measure, wonder at the power captured, fear that the power might escape, might turn against those who thought they controlled it, might consume everything in the rage that fire can become when it breaks free of constraint. The fire transformed everything it touched. Made meat digestible, cooking breaks down tough fibers, kills parasites and bacteria, makes nutrition more accessible, allows extraction of more calories from same amount of food. The improved nutrition supported larger brains, created feedback loop where better nutrition enabled increased intelligence, which enabled better food acquisition, which enabled even better nutrition. Made caves habitable, turned spaces that were too cold and too dark into shelters that could protect through the night, that could become home rather than merely temporary refuge. Made night into time that could be used rather than merely endured. Around the fire, once darkness fell, humans did not simply wait for sleep and sunrise. They talked, they planned, they shared experiences. The fire created the gathering place, the circle where group came together not for work but for community, where attention focused inward rather than outward, where conversation could happen without the distraction of immediate survival needs. Around these flames, language deepened. The day's experiences could be shared and shaped into meaning through words that were themselves like flames, bright, fleeting, dangerous, illuminating. The stories were born narratives that explained the world, that transmitted survival knowledge, that created shared identity and shared values. The fire made possible the conversations that would eventually create culture, create religion, create all the accumulated wisdom that humans would pass from generation to generation. But fire was also destruction. The same flame that cooked food could burn flesh. The same fire that illuminated caves could consume forests. The same heat that drove away predators could destroy everything if it escaped control. Fire required respect, required understanding that it was both servant and master, both gift and curse, both salvation and danger rolled into phenomenon that could not be separated into simple categories of good or bad. We explore the sacred responsibility of the firekeepers, those individuals or families who took on the role of tending flames through darkness, who fed wood to fires through the night, who carried embers when the tribe moved from one camp to another, who understood that letting the fire die was not mere inconvenience, but was catastrophe that could mean death for entire group. The firekeeper was shaman and servant simultaneously held power that came from controlling flame, but also held obligation that bound them to constant vigilance. The techniques for making fire were hard-won knowledge. Friction between wood pieces, the hand drill or bow drill that could create enough heat to ignite tinder if the wood was right, and the technique was right and persistence was sufficient. Percussion striking stones together to create sparks that could ignite prepared tinder if the stones were right, and the striking was right, and conditions were favorable. Each technique required knowledge that took years to master, required practice that was often frustrating, required persistence through countless failures before success became reliable. The fire became portable technology. When groups migrated, when they followed game herds or sought better resources or fled from dangers, they carried fire with them. Carried glowing embers that could be maintained for days if protected properly, that could be fed with small amounts of fuel, that could reignite dead wood wherever the group stopped. The portable fire meant that the light and warmth and cooking capability traveled with the people, meant that each new camp could immediately benefit from fire without the difficulty of creating it anew. But the portability also created dependency. Once fire became integral to human life, living without it became nearly impossible. The groups that lost their fire faced catastrophe, faced cold nights without warmth, faced inability to cook food that had become dietary staple, faced vulnerability to predators that fire had kept at bay. The dependency meant that fire-making knowledge became crucial survival skill, meant that those who possessed the knowledge held power, meant that fire became not just tool, but became foundation on which human life was built. The archaeological evidence shows fire use spreading across human populations. Sites from 1 million years ago show possible evidence of controlled fire use, concentrations of charcoal, burned bones, arrangements of stones that might have been hearths. By 400,000 years ago, the evidence becomes stronger: clear hearths, systematic burning, widespread use across different human populations in different environments. By 100,000 years ago, fire was so integral to human life that archaeological sites without evidence of fire use are the exception rather than the rule. The fire changed human evolution itself. The cooking allowed dietary shifts that changed gut size and brain size. The warmth allowed migrations into temperate zones where humans could not have survived without fire. The light extended the useful day beyond sunrise and sunset, created hours that could be used for activities beyond immediate survival needs. The fire literally made us human, not in metaphorical sense, but in concrete ways that shaped our bodies and our cultures and our possibilities. The chapter closes with flame reflected in watching eyes, human eyes that have learned to hold light, to carry it forward through time, to refuse the night's dominion. The fire that our ancestors captured burns still in every hearth and stove and candle, in every controlled combustion that powers modern civilization, in the metaphorical flames of knowledge and passion, and the drive to illuminate darkness wherever darkness is found. The flame that refused to die, the light that made us human, the heat that burns still in every fire we light, every warmth we create, every push against the darkness that would consume us if we let it. The fire continues burning. The night continues falling, and we continue keeping flames alive, inheritors of the ancient knowledge, carriers of the ancient gift, keepers of the light that was captured so long ago and that must be tended still, must be fed still, must be protected still against the darkness that never stops pressing close. The flame, forever burning, forever illuminating, forever the gift and the responsibility that made us human and that keeps us human still. There was a moment, though moment is wrong word for something that unfolded across millennia, when a hand closed around stone and recognized not just object but possibility. The recognition was not conscious in the way we understand consciousness now, was not thought expressed in words, was not even clear awareness of what was being recognized. but something in the neural structures, something in the patterns of perception and cognition, something in the emerging intelligence perceived that stone could become more than it was, that matter could be shaped according to purpose, that the world did not have to be accepted as given but could be modified to serve human needs. The stone had always been there scattered across ancient landscapes like fallen stars, like Earth's bones exposed to patient wind and patient rain. Every animal that moved through those landscapes encountered stones, stepped over them, walked around them, sometimes used them incidentally. Sea otters using rocks to break open shells, chimpanzees using rocks to crack nuts. But the use was opportunistic, was taking advantage of stones as they were found, was not the deliberate shaping of stone into forms that did not exist in nature. But one day, one time, one hand saw deeper than surface, saw that stone struck against stone could fracture. That fracturing could create edges. That edges could be sharp. That sharpness could cut. That cutting could process food more efficiently than tearing with teeth, could open carcasses to access meat and marrow, could shape wood and plant fibers in ways that hands and teeth could not. The vision might have come from observing natural fractures, stones broken by falling, stones split by frost, stones worn by water into shapes that suggested possibility. Or the vision might have come from accident, someone striking stones together for some other reason, and noticing the flake that broke away, noticing the sharp edge, noticing that the edge could cut. However it came, the vision once seen could not be unseen. The possibility once recognized could not be unrecognized. And so began the long dialogue between human intention and material reality, the shaping that would continue for 2.5 million years and counting, that would extend from simple stone flakes to silicon chips, that would transform not just stones, but the entire face of the earth. We stand in the quiet concentration of the first toolmaker, watching hands move with purpose that is not yet fully conscious, not yet articulated in language, but is present nonetheless, intention shaping matter, mind imposing form upon formless rock. The hands select a stone, feel its weight, its texture, its hardness. The experienced toolmaker, for even in deep time there were individuals more skilled than others, can assess stone's quality through touch and appearance, can tell whether it will flake cleanly or will shatter into useless fragments, can predict how strikes will propagate through the stone's structure. The first tools were crude, simple flakes knocked from larger stones using the percussion method. Hold core stone in one hand, strike it with hammer stone in the other hand. Aim the strike at the right angle and with the right force, and with luck and skill, a flake breaks away with an edge sharp enough to cut. The Alduin tools named for Olduvai Gorge, where they were first recognized by archaeologists, required only few strikes to create, were more accident than design, though the accidents could be repeated, could be improved through practice, could be taught from experienced napper to novice. But the accidents could be controlled. The randomness could be reduced through understanding and skill. And across hundreds of thousands of years, the tools became less accidental and more intentional. The Acheulean hand axes appeared around 1.7 million years ago, showed dramatic advance in sophistication, required dozens or hundreds of strikes to achieve their symmetrical teardrop shape, required understanding of how to thin stone by removing flakes from both faces, required planning multiple steps ahead, required patience to create tool that was far more refined than pure function would have demanded. The hand axes were beautiful, not accidentally beautiful, but intentionally so. The symmetry was too perfect to be merely functional. The careful shaping that created aesthetic form in addition to practical edge showed that even 1.7 million years ago, tool makers cared about more than just utility, cared about form, about elegance, about creating objects that were pleasing to make and to behold. The aesthetic sense was ancient, was not recent human development, but was fundamental to how our ancestors interacted with world, was part of what made them human even when they were not yet us. The Levallois technique appeared around 300,000 years ago, showed even greater sophistication. The technique involved careful preparation of the core, removing flakes from its top surface to create a shape like a tortoise shell, then striking the core at precisely the right angle to remove a single large flake that was already shaped to be useful tool. The Levallois technique required understanding of three-dimensional geometry that is not intuitive, required ability to envision how strikes would propagate through stone structure, required planning that extended beyond immediate action to anticipate multiple steps ahead. The techniques required teaching. Stone napping is not instinctive. Modern experimenters need extensive practice to create even crude Alduin tools, need years to master advanced techniques like Levallois. Children must have watched adults, must have practiced under supervision, must have learned through trial and error how to select appropriate stones, how to angle strikes, how to read the stone's structure and predict where fractures would form. The teaching required patience, adults allowing children to practice, even when practice wasted materials, even when child's efforts produced inferior tools that had to be discarded. The teaching probably required language or proto-language, some way to communicate strike here, or angle the strike this way, or this stone will work better than that stone. The explicit instruction could accelerate learning in ways that pure observation and imitation could not. The ability to teach tool-making became as important as ability to make tools, because the knowledge could be transmitted more efficiently, could be preserved across generations even when individual tool makers died. The tools accumulated. Early humans didn't just make tools and use them and discard them at the site of use. They made tool kits, collections of different tools for different purposes, and carried these kits from place to place. The accumulation required planning beyond immediate needs, required carrying extra weight that wasn't immediately useful, required thinking about what might be needed in future situations that hadn't yet arrived. The forward thinking is what truly separates human tool use from animal tool. Use the ability to create tools in advance of need, to carry tools to where they will be needed, to accumulate knowledge about tools across generations. The tools extended human capability exponentially, allowed processing of foods that would otherwise be inedible, tough plant materials that needed cutting, animal hides that needed scraping, bones that needed cracking to extract marrow that was rich in calories and nutrients, allowed hunting of animals that would otherwise be unobtainable, spears extending reach and force beyond what unarmed humans could achieve, making humans effective predators despite lacking natural weapons like claws or large teeth, allowed construction of shelters, cutting branches, shaping poles, creating structures that protected against weather and predators, allowed creation of clothing, scraping hides to make them soft, cutting and sewing them into garments that allowed humans to survive in climates that naked bodies could not tolerate. The hand that held the stone never stopped extending its reach. The principle established 2.5 million years ago continues operating, the recognition that humans are not limited to biological inheritance, that intelligence applied to materials can create new possibilities, that the gap between imagined tool and actual tool can be bridged through work and skill and accumulated knowledge. The stone tools led to copper tools, led to bronze tools, led to iron tools, led to steel tools, led to all the complex technologies that shape modern life. But the stone remains primary, remains the first technology, the first deliberate shaping of matter according to mental template, the first transformation of world through intention and skill. In museums behind glass cases, the first tools wait. Stone flakes and choppers and hand axes, arranged chronologically to show progression from simple to complex. The tools look crude to modern eyes, rough edges, obvious manufacturing marks, forms that fall short of perfect symmetry. But in the crudeness is the beginning, is the first moment when hands held stone and saw not just stone but possibility, when intelligence shaped matter according to plan that existed first in mind and only later in world. The stone that held intention. The first technology that extended human capability beyond biological inheritance. The shaping that shaped us as we shaped it. The recognition that world could be changed, that human will could reshape material reality, that what was given was not all that could be. The stone remains in archaeological sites and in museums, in the direct line that connects first crude flakes to all tools that followed, in every object that humans have made by imposing intention on matter. The stone, forever holding the intention that made us makers, that made us shapers, that made us human. Language did not descend from heaven complete and perfect, did not arrive fully formed like a gift placed in human hands by benevolent gods. It emerged slowly, mysteriously, over hundreds of thousands of years from grunts and gestures, from the spaces between sounds where meaning gathered like morning mist, from the slow recognition that breath shaped by tongue and teeth could carry thought from one mind to another across the unbridgeable gap of individual consciousness. We open in the wordless world, in the time when communication was immediate and limited warning cries that signaled danger, contact calls that maintained group cohesion, emotional vocalizations that expressed fear or anger or contentment, but could not express anything more abstract, anything more removed from immediate experience. The calls were inherited, written into neural structures through millions of years of evolution, emerging automatically in response to specific stimuli, understood instinctively by those who heard them. But gradually, mysteriously, something changed. The sounds began to stick to things. A particular vocalization became associated with water, not the act of drinking, not the immediate experience of thirst being quenched, but the concept of water itself, the substance that could be referred to even when not present. Another sound attached to danger, another to mother, another to the idea of here versus there, of now versus then, of spatial and temporal relationships that could not be pointed to but could only be indicated through symbols. The association was arbitrary. Any sound could have meant anything. There was nothing inherent in the sound water, that connected it to the liquid substance. But once established, once agreed upon by the community of speakers through processes we cannot now recover, the association became real, became shared convention that allowed communication beyond immediate context. The word summoned the thing even in the thing's absence. And in that summoning, humanity crossed a threshold that animals approaching language have never fully crossed. The threshold was the ability to speak of what is not present. Animals can communicate about immediate circumstances, the predator that is currently approaching, the food source that is currently visible, the social bond that is currently being established or maintained. But human language can discuss things distant in space and time, can plan hunts that will happen tomorrow at locations that are not yet in view, can remember events that happened years ago and that no longer exist except in memory, can imagine scenarios that have never happened and might never happen, exploring possibilities through linguistic description before committing to action. The displacement, the ability of language to transcend immediate context transformed human cognition, made possible the planning that extends beyond immediate needs, the remembering that preserves experiences beyond the moment of occurrence, the imagining that allows humans to envision alternatives before choosing among them, the internal voice that narrates experience, that organizes memories, that plans future actions. This voice emerged from language's capacity for displacement, emerged from the ability to speak internally about things not present, to maintain through words the mental representations that animals presumably lose once immediate stimuli are removed. The grammar emerged gradually. Single words came first, object labels, action terms, simple descriptors. Then two-word combinations that could express relationships, water here, or danger coming, or mother gone. The combinations became more complex. Word order began to carry meaning. Man bite dog means something different from dog bite man, even though the same words are used. Grammatical markers developed endings and particles that indicated past or future tense, that showed relationships between words, that allowed complex ideas to be expressed through structured combinations of simple elements. The grammar was not random. The patterns that appeared in one language appeared in other languages that developed independently, suggesting that grammatical structures are constrained by human cognitive architecture, by the ways that human minds naturally organize information. All languages distinguish objects from actions, distinguish actors from things acted upon, distinguish spatial and temporal relationships, have ways of forming questions and negations, have recursive structures that allow embedding of phrases within phrases to create sentences of unlimited complexity. The vocabulary accumulated like sediment, generation after generation, adding new words, refining old meanings, creating increasingly elaborate ways to carve experience into named categories. The naming was not neutral. To name was to define, to establish boundaries, to create categories that shaped how speakers perceived world. The language that has many words for snow does not just describe snow more precisely, it potentially perceives more distinctions, notices differences that languages with fewer snow words might not notice. To name was also to claim, to control. The voice that could name could also command. The person who could speak persuasively could influence actions of others, could coordinate group activities, could establish social hierarchies through rhetorical skill rather than through physical dominance alone. Language became instrument of power, the power to persuade, to deceive, to construct social realities that served the interests of speakers. The smooth talker, the silver tongue, the persuasive speaker, these figures emerged as language became sophisticated enough to allow manipulation of social perception through words alone. The transmission of knowledge across generations became possible in new ways. Before language, knowledge was transmitted through observation and imitation, young watching elders and copying their behaviors. Language allowed explicit instruction, allowed adults to explain not just what to do, but why to do it, allowed transmission of abstract principles rather than just concrete behaviors, allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations as each generation refined and added to what previous generations had learned. The stories emerged from language's capacity for displacement. If words could refer to absent things, then words could create narratives about events that happened in the past, about places that exist elsewhere, about beings that exist only in imagination. The storytelling served multiple functions, transmitted survival knowledge, established group identity, provided entertainment during the hours when work was done, but sleep had not yet come. But storytelling also did something deeper, created shared realities, established moral frameworks, answered the questions that all humans ask about origins and purposes and meanings. The self emerged through language. Before language, consciousness presumably existed, the felt sense of experiencing, the subjective awareness that characterizes mental life. But self-consciousness, the awareness of awareness, the ability to observe oneself observing, the capacity to ask, who am I? And to recognize the question as itself worthy of examination required language, required the I that could refer to itself, the narrative that could organize experiences into coherent story of personal identity, the internal dialogue that maintains sense of continuity across time. We explore how language shapes thought in ways that speakers cannot easily recognize. The language that forces grammatical marking of gender might make gender more salient to speakers. The language that spatially orients through absolute directions north, south, east, west rather than relative directions left, right might develop different spatial cognition. The language that has specific words for particular emotions might experience or express those emotions differently than language that lacks the words. The linguistic relativity is not absolute. All humans share basic cognitive architecture, regardless of language, but language shapes cognition at the margins, influences what is easily thought and what is difficult to think. The chapter deepens into recognition that we think in language, dream in language, construct our very selves through linguistic categories. That the voice in our heads, the internal narrator who seems so intimate, so essentially us, is itself linguistic construction, is product of language capacity rather than being prior to language. That removing language would not just remove ability to communicate, but would transform consciousness itself in ways we cannot imagine because we cannot think outside language to envision what non-linguistic consciousness would be like. We close with the understanding that every word spoken carries echoes of all previous speakers, that language is inheritance we receive and modify and pass forward, that speaking makes us human in ways that no other capability does. The voice that named the invisible, the sound that became symbol, the transformation that made abstract thought possible, that created self-consciousness, that allowed the accumulation of culture across generations. The voice echoes through time in every word spoken, in every thought, in every attempt to bridge the gap between one consciousness and another through the magical trick of language that carries meaning from speaker to hearer, through nothing more substantial than shaped breath and shared convention. The voice continues speaking. The naming continues. And we are creatures of the word shaped by language as surely as by biology, thinking through words, knowing ourselves through words, connected to each other through words that carry the accumulated wisdom and accumulated errors of all who spoke before us. 10,000 years ago, in the fertile valleys where rivers made life abundant, Humanity made a choice that would bind it forever, the choice to plant, to cultivate, to abandon the wandering life for the rooted life, to exchange freedom for security, hunger for servitude to the seasons and the soil. The choice was not made consciously by any individual or generation, was not decided through counsel or debate, was instead gradual drift across centuries, small modifications to gathering practices, small increases in attention paid to favored plants, small steps that accumulated until the boundary between gathering and farming had been crossed without anyone noticing the crossing. We open in the moment before agriculture, in the last breaths of the nomadic existence that had sustained humans since the beginning, the life of following game herds across seasonal migrations, of knowing which plants fruited when and where, of carrying all possessions because permanence was impossible when survival required mobility. The life was hard, but it was also free. The nomads owed allegiance to no land because all land was temporarily home, could not be conquered because they could move faster than armies could follow, could not be enslaved because their skills were mobility and knowledge of territory, and the ability to survive through movement. The skeletal evidence from this period shows people who were generally healthy, tall for their time, with good teeth, without the bone diseases that would later plague agricultural populations. The time-use studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest work requirements of perhaps 20 hours per week to meet subsistence needs, less than modern office workers, less than modern farmers, less than most occupations in industrial societies. The leisure was real. The freedom was real. The health was real. Then came the seed. Perhaps someone noticed that plants growing near campsites enriched by nitrogen from human waste, protected from animal grazing by human presence, grew larger and produced more seeds than plants growing in wild conditions. Perhaps someone began protecting these favored plants, began weeding out competing plants, began watering them during dry periods. Perhaps someone began deliberately scattering seeds of favored plants near camps, encouraging their growth in convenient locations. The steps were small, were modifications of gathering practices rather than radical innovations, but the modifications accumulated, and gradually, imperceptibly, the humans who planted became bound to what they planted, could not wander when crops needed tending, could not abandon fields during growing season, could not move at will when harvest time approached, and stored grain needed protection from raiders and animals. The planting created surplus, more food per unit of land than gathering could produce. The surplus enabled population growth. More children could survive when food was reliably abundant. But the population growth created trap. Once population exceeded what wild resources could support, returning to nomadic life became impossible. The group was bound to agriculture by its own numbers, was imprisoned by the success that made larger populations possible. The surplus created other problems that nomads never faced. How to store grain so it wouldn't rot or be eaten by insects and rodents. How to defend stored resources from raiders who would take rather than grow. How to organize the labor required at planting and harvest when entire community needed to work simultaneously. How to distribute the surplus when some fields produced more than others, when some families worked harder than others, when claims of ownership and rights to grain created conflicts that sharing societies never experienced. The agriculture created inequality. The nomadic bands were relatively egalitarian, difficult to accumulate possessions when everything must be carried, difficult to claim higher status when survival depended on everyone's contribution, difficult to establish permanent hierarchy when mobility allowed discontented individuals to simply leave. But agricultural societies were different. Some families controlled better land. Some stored more grain. Some could hire or force others to work their fields. The wealth accumulated. The power concentrated. And the egalitarian ethos of nomadic societies gave way to hierarchies of landowners and laborers, wealthy and poor, masters and servants. The agriculture created warfare on scales nomads rarely experienced. Nomadic conflicts were usually brief raids or skirmishes, groups moving too quickly to sustain prolonged conflict, possessing too little worth stealing to justify organized warfare. But agricultural settlements were fixed targets with stored resources worth taking. The villages needed defense. The successful villages built walls, raised armies, developed weapons and tactics for organized violence. And the warfare became endemic. Every harvest season brought risk of raids. Every generation faced threats that required military response. The agriculture changed human bodies. The repetitive labor of farming, bending over furrows, grinding grain, carrying heavy loads created bone stress and joint problems visible in skeletal remains. The diet based on few staple crops created nutritional deficiencies that varied diet of gatherers avoided. The population densities created by agricultural surplus enabled spread of infectious diseases that could establish themselves in settled populations, but that burned out too quickly in small nomadic bands. The average height decreased. The life expectancy fell. The health of early agriculturalists was measurably worse than health of their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Yet agriculture spread across the Fertile Crescent, spread to Europe and Asia and Africa, emerged independently in China and Mesoamerica and New Guinea and Eastern North America. The independent emergence suggests that agriculture was not desperate response to specific crisis, but was transformation that multiple populations chose despite the costs. Was attractive for reasons we do not fully understand. Perhaps the security of stored food outweighed the costs of labor and disease. Perhaps the ability to support larger populations created military advantages that made agricultural societies dominant over nomadic ones. Perhaps the process was trap that could not be reversed once started. The consequences rippled outward across millennia. Agriculture created civilization, created the surplus that allowed some people to specialize in activities beyond food production, created the population densities that made cities possible, created the stable settlements that enabled accumulation of knowledge and technology, created writing to record transactions and transmit information, created mathematics to measure fields and calculate harvests, created complex social organization to coordinate labor and distribute resources, created art and architecture and all the achievements that define civilization. But agriculture also created the problems that plague civilization still, created the environmental degradation that comes from intensive land use, created the warfare that comes from defending and raiding resources, created the inequality that comes from some controlling land and labor while others work for subsistence, created the alienation that comes from repetitive labor that serves others' interests rather than one's own needs, created the vulnerability to famine when crops fail, and to epidemic when diseases spread through crowded populations. The chapter closes in a field at dusk, watching farmers return to village as light fades. They walk slowly, bodies bent from day's labor, minds calculating whether harvest will be sufficient, spirits bound to this place by the crops they have planted and the grain they have stored and the investments they have made that cannot be abandoned without losing everything. The seed that imprisoned them also feeds them. The bargain with earth continues, provides abundance but demands servitude, creates security but requires vigilance, enables civilization but destroys the freedom that nomadic ancestors knew. The seed that imprisoned and fed, the choice that could not be undone, The transformation that created everything we value about civilization, while destroying everything our ancestors valued about freedom. The agriculture continues in every field and farm, in every harvest that feeds cities, in every surplus that enables specialization and culture, and all the complexity that makes modern life possible. The seed grows still. The binding continues. And we remain bound inheritors of the choice made 10,000 years ago, living in the world that agriculture created, unable to return to the wandering life even if we wanted to because the world is too full, the populations too large, the dependencies too deep. The seed, forever planted, forever growing, forever the choice that shaped everything that followed. When humans began to settle, began to claim territory as permanent possession rather than temporary shelter, the concept of ours and theirs solidified like cooling metal hard, definite, sharp enough to draw blood. The boundary that had been fluid became fixed. The identity that had been permeable became exclusive. The world that had been open became divided into inside and outside, into those who belong and those who are excluded, into us and them. We open at the first wall, not metaphorical barrier, but actual stones stacked one upon another, marking the boundary between community and stranger, between safety and danger, between the protected circle and the wilderness beyond. The wall might have been simple at first, perhaps just a ring of thorn bush around a settlement, perhaps a shallow ditch backed by earthen rampart, perhaps a fence of wooden stakes. But the principle was established: this ground is different from that ground. These people have rights here that those people do not have. The world divides at this line. The wall was protection. That much was obvious and remains obvious still. The wall kept out predators, the lions and hyenas and leopards that had preyed on humans since before humans were humans. Kept out raiders, the neighboring groups who would take grain stored through hard labor, who would capture women and children, who would kill men who resisted. The wall created safety within its circumference, allowed the vulnerable to live without constant vigilance, allowed children to play and elders to rest and workers to focus on tasks without watching for danger. But the wall was also declaration, was statement of ownership and exclusion that nomadic societies rarely made. Before walls, territory was vague. Tribes had ranges they normally used, but the boundaries overlapped. The claims were not absolute. Individuals could move between groups through marriage or adoption, or simply by walking away from one group and joining another. After walls, territory became property. The land within wall belonged to the community in ways that created obligations and rights unknown to nomads. The wall created the citizen. Inside the wall, people had status, had protection, had access to stored resources and collective defense. Outside the wall, people had nothing that the community was obligated to provide. The distinction created legal and moral categories: the insider who deserved consideration, the outsider who could be ignored or exploited or driven away without moral qualm. The wall drew line between who mattered and who did not, between whose needs were community's concern and whose needs could be disregarded. The walls multiplied across the landscape as villages became towns, became cities. Each settlement defined itself by what it excluded: the barbarian, the foreigner, the enemy who stood outside the protected circle. The walls grew higher, thicker, more elaborate, became not just practical defense but symbolic statement monuments to power and permanence of those within, warnings to those without. The impressive walls of ancient cities declared to all who approached, "We are strong, we are permanent, we can defend what is ours, approach at your peril." And between walls, in the spaces that belonged to no one, danger accumulated. The no-man's land between settled territories became space of violence where raiders operated, where outlaws hid, where those excluded from all communities gathered. The barbarian was created by the wall's existence, was defined by position outside the civilized circle, was assumed to be savage because savage was what existed beyond the boundaries that civilization drew. We explore how walls shaped identity. The people within wall defined themselves by shared residence, shared protection, shared contribution to common defense and common good. The citizen was person who belonged, who had roots, who could claim "we" and mean the community within walls. But the definition created obligation. The citizen owed loyalty, owed military service, owed taxes and labor for maintenance of walls and other common infrastructure. The freedom of nomadic life, the ability to leave if leadership was oppressive or conflicts were unresolvable, was traded for security and belonging that walls provided. The walls also created xenophobia, fear, and suspicion of outsiders who might threaten what insiders had built. The stranger arriving at gates was automatically suspect, might be spy or scout for raiding party, might bring disease, might disrupt carefully maintained social order. The hospitality that nomadic groups often extended to travelers became conditional in walled settlements, extended only after questioning, only after verification of peaceful intent, only after establishment of guarantees that the stranger would not abuse the community's trust. The walls became prisons as well as protections. Once established, walls bound inhabitants as surely as they excluded strangers. The investment in walls construction, the agricultural fields outside that depended on walls protection, the social networks and property claims and status hierarchies that existed within the community, all these made leaving difficult even when life within walls became oppressive. The walls that protected also trapped, created dependencies that ensured most people would endure hardship rather than abandon the security that walls represented. The chapter deepens into recognition that walls create the very threats they claim only to protect against. The division of world into ours and theirs generates conflicts that fluid boundaries do not generate. The claim that this land belongs exclusively to this people guarantees conflict with other peoples who claim different boundaries or who deny that land can be owned at all. The walls that protect against today's enemies create tomorrow's enemies by the very act of exclusion, by the statement that those outside do not belong and have no legitimate claims to what lies within. But walls also enable scale. The protection that walls provide allows accumulation of resources, of population, of specialized knowledge and complex social organization. Without walls, the permanent settlements that make civilization possible could not exist. Without permanent settlements, the cities that concentrate knowledge and culture could not form. Without cities, most of what we value about human achievement, art, science, literature, philosophy could not have developed. The walls are prerequisite for civilization, even as they create civilization's characteristic problems of inequality and warfare, and the distinction between insider and outsider. We close standing at ancient wall in moonlight, feeling the weight of stones that have divided human from human for millennia. The stones are cold beneath our hands, are rough with age, are silent about the intentions of those who placed them, about the fears that drove their construction, about the countless times they were breached or held against assault. The walls stand still in ruins mostly, their defensive purpose obsolete but their symbolic power undiminished. Every border, every fence, every line drawn on map echoes that first wall, repeats the division between belonging and exclusion. The wall that divided belonging, the barrier that created categories of citizen and stranger, the protection that required exclusion, the stones that separate us still in every border that restricts movement, in every distinction between insider and outsider, In every claim that this territory belongs to these people, and that others must remain outside or enter only on terms that insiders dictate. The walls stand, the divisions persist, and we remain divided inheritors of the first walls, living in worlds structured by boundaries between belonging and exclusion, unable to imagine how to have the security without the division, the protection without the enmity, the community without the walls. The wall, forever dividing, forever protecting, forever marking the boundary between us and them. Before writing, memory was living thing held in minds, transmitted through voices, changing slightly with each telling, like a river changing course with each season's flood. What was remembered lived, passed from generation to generation through the spoken word, through the stories that elders told and children learned and eventually told in their turn. But what was forgotten died, left no trace, existed only in the brief moment of remembering before slipping away into the void where all unrecorded experience goes. And there was no appeal against forgetting's judgment, no way to recover what memory had released. But then came the miracle of inscription, the recognition that marks upon clay or stone or papyrus could hold words beyond the life of the speaker, could preserve thought beyond the thinker, could make memory external and permanent and immune to the dissolution that claims all flesh. The invention happened independently in multiple locations in Sumer around 3200 BCE, in Egypt around 3000 BCE, in China around 1200 BCE, in Mesoamerica around 600 BCE. The independent emergence suggests that writing addressed universal human need, the need to record, to preserve, to communicate across distances of space and time that speech could not bridge. We open in ancient Sumer, in the cities that rose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, watching a scribe press wedge-shaped stylus into soft clay. The tablet is small, fits in the hand. The marks the scribe makes are simple combinations of wedge shapes that represent syllables, that together form words, that together form sentences documenting some mundane transaction. So many sheep, so much grain, paid by this person to that person, recorded in this year of this ruler's reign. The content is boring, but the fact of writing is revolutionary. The scribe is creating external memory information that will persist after the transaction is forgotten, that will survive after the scribe and the buyer and the seller are all dead, that will speak to future generations about economic relations in a world that will eventually become ancient history. The tablet is time machine, is message in a bottle cast forward through the centuries. is voice speaking across the void that normally silences all voices. The first writing was mundane accounting records, inventories of temple goods, lists of property and payments. But the implications were infinite. If words could be captured, then knowledge could accumulate across generations. The farmer who learned through hard experience which crops grew well in which conditions could record that knowledge for descendants. The astronomer who tracked stars and seasons could preserve observations across decades. The ruler who established laws could make those laws permanent rather than subject to the memory and interpretation of whoever succeeded to power. Writing transformed administration, made possible the governance of territories too large for personal authority, too complex for oral tradition to manage. The tax records, the census lists, the legal codes all required writing to function at scale. The empires that arose after writing's invention could coordinate activities across vast distances, could maintain continuity of policy across generations, could accumulate bureaucratic knowledge that made complex governance possible. Writing transformed religion. The oral traditions that varied from teller to teller could be fixed in canonical texts that claimed ultimate authority. The sacred teachings could be preserved exactly, could be studied and interpreted, could be defended against innovation and heresy. The priests became scholars, learned to read and write, maintained the texts, controlled access to knowledge that was written but not widely readable. The scriptures gained authority that oral tradition never had. The written word seemed fixed, seemed eternal, seemed closer to divine truth than the flexible and changeable oral traditions. Writing transformed history. Before writing, the past was what could be remembered, and what could be retold was necessarily brief, was necessarily recent, was necessarily shaped by present concerns of those doing the remembering. After writing, the past could be preserved in forms that future generations could consult directly. The events could be recorded by those who witnessed them. The interpretations could be captured and compared and evaluated. The long sweep of time became accessible in ways that oral cultures could never achieve. But writing also killed things, killed the art of memory that had been cultivated in oral cultures, the mnemonic techniques, the vast amounts of information held in living minds, the cultural value placed on remembering, killed the fluidity of oral tradition, the ability of stories to adapt to new circumstances, to incorporate new understandings, to remain living tradition rather than dead text. Killed the communal ownership of knowledge. What was written belonged to those who could read, and literacy became tool of social stratification. We explore how writing created new forms of power. The scribe who could read and write held power over those who could record transactions, could interpret laws, could preserve or distort information according to interest. The literate class became gatekeepers controlling access to accumulated knowledge, interpreting texts, maintaining monopoly on written culture. The power of writing was power to control the past through controlling the records, to control the present through controlling the texts that governed it, to control the future through determining what would be recorded for future generations. The written word claimed authority beyond what spoken word could claim. The scripture, once written, could not be denied. The law, once codified, seemed permanent and objective. The history, once recorded, seemed factual rather than interpretive. The fixity of writing created illusion of certainty, made the provisional seem absolute, made the contingent seem necessary, made human decisions seem like divine or natural truth. But the permanence was also illusion. The clay tablets broke, the papyrus decayed, the manuscripts burned. The written record that seemed eternal was actually fragile, subject to fire and flood, and the simple passage of time that reduced even stone inscriptions to illegibility. Most of what was written has been lost. The texts that survive are tiny fraction of what was produced, selected by accident more than by design, preserved through contingencies that no one could predict. The chapter deepens into reflection on what writing changed about consciousness itself. The ability to externalize memory changed how humans thought about thought, made possible the analytical stance toward one's own thinking. The ability to compare different versions of an idea. The treatment of ideas as objects that could be manipulated and refined. The logical thinking, the systematic philosophy, the scientific method all depended on writing's ability to hold thoughts still long enough to examine them critically. We close in silent library, surrounded by texts that speak though their authors are centuries dead. The books line the shelves in ordered rows. The pages wait to be turned. The words wait to be read. And in the waiting is the miracle that thoughts from distant times and distant places can be summoned by the simple act of reading, that the dead can speak to the living through marks on page, that consciousness can transcend the body that generated it, and can persist in external form that outlives the mortal flesh. The word that became eternal, the inscription that defeated death, the permanence that was also prison, fixing what should remain fluid, preserving what should adapt, claiming certainty where uncertainty is more honest. The writing continues in every book and document and digital text, in every attempt to capture thought in external form, in every hope that what we write will outlast us. The words wait, the texts accumulate, and we remain creatures of the written word shaped by literacy, thinking through texts, knowing ourselves and our history and our possibilities through the written records that connect us to the long conversation that writing makes possible. The Word, forever written, forever read, forever speaking across the silence that should have claimed it. Empires rise not from necessity, but from ambition, from the recognition that power can accumulate, that territories can be conquered, that the wealth of distant lands can be extracted and concentrated in imperial centers that grow wealthy on the labor and resources of the periphery. The empire is particular kind of political formation, distinct from the tribe or the city-state or the nation. Is organization of inequality on continental scale the metropole that commands, the provinces that obey, the flow of wealth and power always from edges toward center, from conquered toward conquerors. We open at the height of empire not one particular empire, but the idea of empire itself, the pattern that repeats across history as kingdoms expand into superstates that claim dominion over vast territories and diverse peoples. The imperial capital is magnificent. The monuments declare permanence, temples that reach toward heaven, palaces that house thousands, walls that stretch beyond sight, aqueducts that bring water from distant mountains, roads that connect the capital to every corner of the realm. The abundance flows inward like blood through arteries. The grain ships arrive from Egypt, from North Africa, carrying the harvests that feed the million residents of Rome. The gold comes from Spain, from Dacia, extracted by slave labor in mines where life expectancy is measured in months. The silks arrive from the east, the spices from the south, the amber from the north. The city consumes the production of continents, gives back only the order that its legions impose and the culture that its literature and laws represent. The citizens believe in their empire, believe it brings civilization to barbarians, order to chaos, progress to peoples who would remain primitive without imperial guidance. The ideology of empire is always the same: we conquer for your own good. We rule because we are superior. We extract your wealth because we use it better than you could. Our domination is justified by our achievements. And the ideology is partially true. The empire does build roads and aqueducts, does spread literacy and law, does create periods of stability that allow trade and culture to flourish. But the empire requires constant expansion to fund itself. The conquests generate plunder that finances the next conquests. The new provinces provide tax revenue that maintains the legions that conquer more provinces. The system is inherently unstable, must grow or collapse, must continually incorporate new territories because the administrative costs and military expenses exceed what existing territories can sustain. The expansion has logical limit eventually. The empire reaches boundaries where further conquest is not profitable, where the costs of governing distant territories exceed the revenues they generate. The empire requires constant suppression of rebellion to maintain itself. The conquered peoples do not willingly accept subjugation, they resist, they rebel, they seek opportunities to break free from imperial control. The legions that conquered them must remain to hold them. The taxes that fund the legions must be extracted from people who see no benefit in paying them. The resentment accumulates. The revolts multiply. And the military costs of suppression grow until they consume resources that might have been used productively. We explore the imperial logic that justifies itself through claims of bringing civilization. The Roman Empire spreading Latin and law across Europe. The British Empire claiming to bring modern governance and Christianity to peoples who need enlightening. The rhetoric is always similar. The empire is burden nobly borne, is responsibility to spread superior culture, is civilizing mission that justifies the violence and extraction that accompanies it. And some of the conquered believe it, internalize the imperial narrative, become more Roman than Rome, more British than Britain, identify with the empire that subjugates them. But others resist. In the provinces, rebellion simmers. The memory of independence persists. The resentment of conquest is passed from generation to generation. And when the empire weakens, when succession crises divide the center, when external enemies threaten the borders, when economic decline reduces the resources available for suppression, the provinces break away. The empire that seemed permanent reveals itself to be temporary, to be held together by force rather than by loyalty, to be system that works only when the center is strong enough to compel obedience. The empire spreads its legions thinly across too much territory. The frontiers are distant, require supply lines that stretch for thousands of miles, defend against enemies who grow stronger as they learn from contact with imperial forces. The administrative costs multiply the bureaucracy required to govern diverse peoples across vast distances, the infrastructure that must be maintained, the garrisons that must be supplied. and the corruption deepens the distance between center and periphery, creates opportunities for governors to enrich themselves, for officials to skim revenues, for the resources intended for imperial purposes to disappear into private hands. The inequality within empire creates internal tensions. The capital grows wealthy while the provinces are impoverished. The citizens enjoy rights and privileges that subjects are denied. The favored peoples are granted autonomy while others are brutally suppressed. The disparities create resentment not just between rulers and ruled, but between different groups of subjects, those who benefit from collaboration with empire and those who are exploited, those who receive imperial favor and those who face imperial wrath. And eventually, inevitably, the empire collapses. Not usually from sudden catastrophic defeat, but from gradual dissolution, provinces breaking away, frontiers contracting, revenues declining, legions going unpaid and mutinying, or being defeated by enemies who were once easily contained. The collapse accelerates each loss of territory, reduces revenue, which reduces military capacity, which enables further loss of territory in vicious cycle that cannot be reversed. The empire that took centuries to build unravels in decades. The chapter deepens into reflection on why empires always fall. The extraction is unsustainable, cannot continue indefinitely taking wealth from periphery, without impoverishing the sources from which wealth is drawn. The expansion has limits. The empire eventually reaches boundaries where further growth is impossible or unprofitable. The diversity is unmanageable. The attempt to govern many peoples with different languages and customs and traditions under single system creates administrative complexity that eventually overwhelms the bureaucracy. The inequality is destabilizing. The concentration of wealth and power in center creates resentment in periphery that explodes when opportunity arises. But most fundamentally, the empire devours its children, sends them to fight in distant wars that serve imperial interests, but not the interests of those who fight and die, extracts from them the taxes that impoverish them while enriching distant capital they will never see, demands loyalty to state that sees them as resources to be exploited rather than as citizens whose welfare matters. And when the children can no longer bear the devouring, when the subjects can no longer endure the extraction, when the conquered peoples can finally break free, the empire falls. We close in ruins. The monuments are weathered. The aqueducts are broken. The roads are overgrown. The capital that once commanded continents is reduced to rubble and memory. The stones that proclaimed eternal empire bear only moss and the marks of time. And in the ruins is the lesson that every empire contains its own destruction, that the ambition that builds empires is the ambition that ensures their fall, that the power concentrated in centers creates the resistance in peripheries that eventually overcomes that power. The empire that devoured its children, the glory that was unsustainable, the collapse that empire always claims will never come, but that always comes regardless. The pattern repeats across history: rise and fall, expansion and contraction, the accumulation of power and its inevitable dissipation. The empires rise still, the ambition persists, and we remain susceptible to the glory of the monuments, to the rhetoric of civilization, to the belief that this time will be different, that our empire is justified where others were not, that our expansion serves higher purpose than mere ambition. The ruins testify otherwise. The fallen empires whisper warnings. But ambition is deaf to history's lessons. And so the pattern continues: the building and the falling, the rise and the ruin, the empire that devours until it is itself devoured by time and by the resistance of those it conquered. The empire, forever rising, forever falling, forever teaching the lesson that power concentrated cannot be maintained, that domination breeds resistance, that all empires end. In the year that no one can pinpoint precisely because death moved faster than recording, because scribes themselves were dying, because certainty dissolved in the face of incomprehensible mortality, a plague arrived and transformed everything it touched. The disease came without warning, without precedent, without mercy. Came perhaps on ships from distant ports where it had already killed uncounted thousands. Came perhaps from animals whose diseases jumped to human hosts. Came perhaps from conditions that human crowding and human filth had created. The origin mattered less than the effect, the sudden, overwhelming presence of death on scale that made all previous experience of mortality seem manageable by comparison. We open in a city before the plague, a place of routines and assumptions, where daily life follows patterns established across generations, where the future is expected to resemble the past, where death is familiar tragedy but not overwhelming catastrophe. The city is crowded, people living close together in narrow streets, sharing wells and markets and communal spaces, moving through each other's lives in the density that cities create. The crowding is normal, is simply how cities are, has been this way for so long that no one questions it. Then the sickness comes. Perhaps the first cases appear near the docks where foreign ships arrive. perhaps in the poorest quarters where crowding is most severe, perhaps simultaneously in multiple locations, because the disease has been spreading invisibly before symptoms appear. The symptoms are distinctive fever, swelling, hemorrhaging, delirium. The progression is rapid health to symptoms to death in days or sometimes hours. The mortality is catastrophic. Half or more of those infected die despite prayers and treatments and the best efforts of healers who themselves are dying in numbers that make healing impossible. The bodies accumulate in the streets where they fell, in houses where families died together, in churches where people gathered seeking divine intervention. The living cannot bury the dead quickly enough. The graveyards fill. The bodies are stacked in pits. The mass graves receive hundreds at once without ceremony or individual marking. The smell of death hangs over the city. The smoke from burning corpses darkens the sky, and the survivors flee carrying infection to uninfected regions, spreading the plague along every road and river and coastline. The social order collapses. The authorities who should maintain order are dying or fleeing. The economic systems that should provide necessities break down when workers are dead or absent. The markets close. The shops are abandoned. The money becomes worthless when there is nothing to buy. The laws become unenforceable when there is no one to enforce them. The city that was orderly and governed becomes chaos where survival is individual effort and where communal structures have ceased to function. The plague is democratic in its way, kills rich and poor, pious and sinful, young and old, without regard for human categories of worth and status. The wealth cannot buy protection because there is no protection to buy. The power cannot command immunity because disease respects no authority. The piety brings no divine favor because God, if God exists, seems absent or indifferent. The randomness is itself a kind of judgment, exposes the vanity of human hierarchies, reveals that the social structures humans construct are gossamer before the power of micro that care nothing for human distinctions. We explore how plague transforms society in ways that survive the epidemic. The labor shortages shift economic power. The surviving workers can demand higher wages because they are scarce, can refuse oppressive conditions because the employers need them more than they need the employment. The religious authority is questioned when prayers prove ineffective, when priests die at same rates as sinners, when no amount of penance prevents infection. The claim that church mediates relationship with divine loses credibility. The old orders are weakened, and new orders emerge from the chaos, new families rise as old dynasties die out. New ideas circulate as traditional authorities lose influence. New possibilities open because the rigid structures that confined them have been shattered. But plague also reveals resilience. The communities that care for sick even at risk to themselves. The individuals who continue burying the dead when others flee. The healers who maintain their posts until they themselves are killed by the disease they fight. The courage is remarkable, the willingness to face death for duty or compassion, or simply because someone must do these things, and running away, though rational, feels like betrayal of fundamental human obligations. The plague reveals what people believe when certainty is stripped away. Some pray. Some drink and revel, determined to enjoy life while life remains. Some seek scapegoats, blame foreigners or minorities or those whose beliefs differ, express through violence the desperate need to explain the inexplicable. Some turn inward, find in catastrophe opportunity for spiritual reflection or moral reform. Some care for others despite the cost. Some save only themselves despite the shame. The plague is diagnostic, reveals character that comfortable times conceal, shows what remains when social conventions and future expectations are removed. The chapter deepens into reflection on what plague teaches: the fragility of civilization that seems so solid, but that collapses so quickly when disease disrupts the systems on which civilized life depends. The contingency of progress that can be reversed in single generation by catastrophe that humans cannot control or predict. The reality that human dominion is never complete, that microbes and viruses care nothing for human ambitions and achievements, that nature retains power to devastate despite all the technologies and institutions that humans build to protect themselves. The plague also teaches humility. The medieval Europeans who endured the Black Death learned that their civilization, which they believed was pinnacle of human achievement, which they thought was secured by Christian faith and social order, could be nearly destroyed by disease that they could not understand or prevent or cure. The realization that human power has limits, that some forces remain beyond human control, that catastrophe can strike without warning and without possibility of prevention. This realization is both terrifying and clarifying. Is reminder that human existence is always precarious, always dependent on circumstances that cannot be fully controlled. We close in silence after the plague has passed, in the changed world where survivors must rebuild not just structures but meanings. The city is quieter, the missing voices never to be heard again. the missing hands never to do the work they did, the missing presence felt in every emptiness. The survivors are changed, have seen death on scale that transforms understanding of life, have made choices under pressure that revealed things about themselves they might prefer not to know, have lost so much that what remains feels both precious and fragile. The question that haunts the aftermath is not, why did this happen? But what does it mean? The religious explain through sin and divine judgment. The rational seek medical or environmental causes. The philosophers contemplate the randomness and the suffering and the lack of clear moral pattern. But perhaps the meaning is simply that there is no meaning that catastrophes happen because microbes evolve and spread and sometimes find conditions where they can multiply catastrophically. That suffering is not judgment and survival is not virtue, that the universe operates according to natural laws that care nothing for human hopes and fears. The plague that erased certainty, the death that revealed fragility, the catastrophe that no empire could prevent, no prayer could deflect, no human understanding could explain. The plague passes, but its lessons remain lessons about limits of human power, about contingency of human achievements, about the precarity that underlies even the most stable and prosperous times. The plagues come still, sometimes literally as epidemics, sometimes metaphorically as catastrophes that overwhelm human capacity to respond. And each time the lessons are relearned, we are not as powerful as we believe. Our control is not as complete as we assume, and the ground beneath civilization is always less solid than it appears. The plague, forever teaching, forever revealing, forever erasing the certainty that allows us to forget how fragile everything is. For millennia, human labor was human labor, muscles straining against weight, hands shaping materials through repeated motion, the pace of work determined by the pace of human bodies which have limits that cannot be exceeded. The farmer plowed at the speed the ox could walk. The blacksmith hammered at the rate arms could swing. The spinner spun at the pace fingers could twist. The limitations were absolute production could increase only by adding more workers or extending hours, never by fundamentally changing the relationship between effort and output. Then came the machine. First water wheels and windmills harnessing natural forces, using the power of falling water and moving air to turn millstones and pump bellows and do work that would have required dozens of humans. Then steam engines burning coal to boil water, to create pressure, to drive pistons that turned wheels that powered machinery. Then assembly lines organizing human workers as components of larger mechanical systems, where each person performed one small task repeatedly as the product moved past on conveyor. We open in the moment of transformation, watching the first factories rise in valleys where rivers can power the machinery, watching villages become cities as workers flood in from countryside seeking wages, watching the old agrarian order dissolve as industrial order imposes its relentless rhythms. The factory is new kind of space, enormous building, housing hundreds of machines and thousands of workers, filled with noise that drowns conversation, powered by steam that hisses and clanks, and occasionally explodes when safety mechanisms fail. The machine promised liberation from the drudgery of manual labor that had defined human work since agriculture began, liberation from the limitations of human strength and endurance, liberation from the scarcity that had characterized most human existence since the beginning. And the machine delivered abundance beyond what any previous age had imagined. Goods mass-produced at costs that made them affordable to ordinary people. Food grown in quantities that could feed cities that would have starved in previous centuries. Transportation that moved people and materials at speeds that made geography shrink and the world become smaller. But the machine also extracted terrible costs. The factories belched smoke that blackened skies, dumped waste that poisoned rivers, created industrial wasteland around every manufacturing center. The labor was soul-destroying repetitive motions performed thousands of times per day, working at machine's pace rather than at human pace, treated as extension of machinery rather than as person with dignity and autonomy. The workers were expendable, fired when demand dropped, replaced when injured, forced to compete for wages that were always pushed toward minimum necessary for survival. The children worked in mines pulling coal carts through tunnels too small for adults, in textile mills tending machines whose moving parts regularly severed fingers and hands, in factories breathing air thick with dust and chemical fumes. The childhood that had been spent in learning and playing and gradual introduction to adult work became brutal labor from age 5 or 6, until exhaustion or injury made work impossible. The mortality was horrific: children dying in industrial accidents, dying from lung diseases, dying from simple exhaustion at ages when they should have been beginning adult life. The countryside emptied as peasants became proletarians. The agricultural workers who had lived on land for generations found themselves displaced by enclosures that privatized common lands, by mechanization that reduced labor needs, by economic pressures that made small-scale farming unviable. They moved to cities seeking factory work, found themselves living in slums where disease spread easily and sanitation was primitive, found their traditional skills were worthless, and their only asset was their labor, which they sold for whatever wages they could get. The traditional communities and crafts that had persisted for generations were swept away in single lifetime. The artisan who had spent years learning craft found that factory could produce same goods faster and cheaper, using unskilled workers operating machines. The pride in workmanship, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and functional, the status that came from mastery of complex skills, all these were lost when production became mechanical and work became repetitive operation of machinery that anyone could learn in days. We explore the dialectic of industrial revolution, how it created both wealth and poverty, both progress and degradation, both liberation and new forms of bondage. The factory owner grew rich beyond imagining, accumulated capital, built mansions, exercised economic power that rivaled the political power of aristocrats. The worker grew expendable, was paid subsistence wages, lived in slums, faced injury and death in unsafe workplaces, had no recourse when treated unjustly, because the power imbalance was absolute. The earth itself began showing signs of exhaustion. The forests were cleared for farmland and for fuel. The coal mines dug deeper and deeper, scarring landscapes and poisoning groundwater. The smoke from factories accumulated in atmosphere, beginning the slow process of atmospheric change that would eventually alter global climate. The accumulated waste of industrial production poisoned rivers and soil, killed fish and vegetation, created dead zones where nothing could live. But the machine was also democracy's engine in ways that complicated simple condemnation. The abundance made possible by industrial production raised living standards eventually. After generations of exploitation, workers gained rights and wages and conditions that made industrial labor tolerable if not pleasant. The goods that factories produced made formerly luxurious items accessible to ordinary people, clothing and furniture, and tools that peasants could never have afforded became widely available. The wealth generated by industry funded education and infrastructure, and all the public goods that characterized modern societies. The chapter deepens into recognition that industrial revolution was not something that happened to humanity, but was something humanity chose, because the promises of abundance were real. chose because the alternative seemed worse, chose because once some societies industrialized, other societies had to industrialize or be dominated by those who had. The choice was not simple good or evil, but was complex bargain trading certain goods for other goods, accepting certain costs in exchange for certain benefits, transforming world in ways that created winners and losers, but that could not be reversed once started. We close in silent factory at night, machinery dormant but present. The machines wait patient, tireless, ready to resume their rhythms when morning comes. The smell of oil and metal hangs in the air. The floor is stained from decades of use. The windows are dark, and in the silence is the understanding the world the machine created is the world we inhabit still. The abundance and the devastation are inseparable. The liberation and the exploitation are twins born from same revolution. The machine that unmade the world. The revolution that could not be reversed. The transformation that brought both progress and catastrophe, both wealth and immiseration, both the power to reshape Earth and the beginning of Earth's degradation. The machines continue running. The factories continue producing. And we continue living in the world they created, inheritors of industrial revolution, beneficiaries of its abundance, victims of its externalities, unable to return to pre-industrial life even if we wanted to because the world is too full, the dependencies too deep, the systems too entrenched. The machine, forever running, forever transforming, forever creating and destroying simultaneously. In the summer of 1914, as harvests ripened and cities basked in the confidence of an age that believed in progress and reason, the old world ended, though few recognized the ending until it was complete. The previous century had been largely peaceful for the great powers, some colonial conflicts in distant lands, some brief wars that were decisively won or lost, but nothing that threatened the fundamental order that had emerged after Napoleon's defeat. The world seemed stable, rational, governed by leaders who understood that war between modern nations would be catastrophic and therefore would not happen. We open in the last days before the Great War, in the deceptive calm when mobilization could still seem like grand adventure, when young men enlisted with flowers in their rifles and smiles on their faces, when everyone believed the fighting would be brief and glorious and over by Christmas. The assassinations in Sarajevo had set diplomatic machinery in motion, the ultimatums and counter-ultimatums, the mobilizations that were supposed to be deterrents, but that became commitments, the alliances that were supposed to prevent war, but that ensured that local conflict would become continental catastrophe. Then came the trenches. The war that was supposed to be war of movement became war of attrition, as the advantages of defense overwhelmed the advantages of offense. The machine guns could kill faster than men could advance. The artillery could destroy faster than engineers could fortify. The barbed wire created killing zones where attacks became massacres. And so the armies dug and created parallel lines of trenches stretching from English Channel to Swiss border, separated by no-man's-land where nothing lived except rats, and occasionally the bodies of those who had tried to cross and failed. The conditions in trenches were beyond anything the soldiers had imagined when they enlisted. The mud was constant rain-filled trenches that had inadequate drainage, created soup of clay and water that was knee-deep or waist-deep, that soldiers lived in for weeks at a time. The rats were everywhere, fed on corpses in no-man's-land, grew large and bold, invaded the trenches, and consumed any food left unguarded. The lice were inescapable, infested clothing and hair, caused constant itching, spread trench fever that could kill as surely as bullets. The artillery transformed earth into moonscape. The shells fell constantly, sometimes sporadic harassing fire, sometimes intensive barrages that lasted hours or days, creating craters 20 feet deep, destroying trenches and dugouts, burying men alive or blowing them to pieces so small that nothing remained to identify. The sound was beyond description, thunderous impacts that ruptured eardrums, concussive force that stopped hearts, psychological pressure that drove some soldiers mad even when they were physically unharmed. The gas appeared chlorine at first, then phosgene, then mustard gas that burned skin and lungs, that transformed breath itself into poison, that created death that was slow and agonizing and terrifying in ways that bullets were not. The masks provided some protection, but not complete protection. The gas settled in low areas and trenches. The attacks came suddenly when wind was favorable, and the deaths were grotesque: men drowning in their own fluids, men blinded and burned, men dying over days from injuries that left no visible wounds but destroyed lungs from inside. The attacks were futile. The generals ordered men to go over the top, to climb out of trenches and advance across no-man's-land toward enemy positions. The machine guns opened fire. The artillery created barrage that cut advancing soldiers to pieces. The men fell by thousands in single morning, in single attack, for gains measured in yards, if any gains were made at all. The Somme offensive killed 60,000 British soldiers on first day alone, killed them for advance of a few hundred yards that was lost within days. The casualties were beyond comprehension, millions dead, millions maimed, for territorial adjustments that meant nothing to those who died achieving them. We explore how the war shattered the optimism of pre-war age. The belief in progress that human society was steadily improving, that rationality was triumphing over barbarism, that the future would be better than the past was buried in Flanders fields. The faith in technology that scientific advance brought only benefits, that modern civilization was more humane than previous ages, was destroyed by technology of killing that made previous war seem almost gentle by comparison. The confidence in leadership that those who governed were competent and wise, that they would not needlessly sacrifice the governed, was obliterated by generals who sent men to die in attacks everyone knew were hopeless. The empires that entered war confident emerged broken, or did not emerge at all. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into successor states. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Russian Empire fell to revolution. The German Empire was defeated and humiliated. Even the victorious empires British and French were exhausted, were financially ruined, were psychologically scarred in ways that would shape the next decades. The certainties that had guided pre-war world were gone. Belief in progress, in rational self-interest, in the basic decency of civilized nations. What emerged from war was world more cynical, more uncertain, more aware that civilization is thin veneer over something darker. The young men who survived returned home changed, had seen things that could not be spoken, had done things that haunted them, had lost faith in the societies that had sent them to die. The generation that had danced before the war could not dance after. The joy seemed obscene when so many were dead. The confidence seemed absurd when everything they had believed had proven false. The chapter deepens into reflection on what was lost, not just the millions of dead, but the confidence in human progress, the belief that rationality would triumph, the innocence that could not survive the revelation of what humans were willing to do to each other when national interest and honor and alliance obligations demanded it. The war proved that industrial civilization applied to warfare created carnage on scales that made all previous wars seem almost bearable. That the same technologies that created abundance could create slaughter. That progress in one domain did not guarantee progress in another. We close in silence, standing at memorial where names of the dead stretch beyond counting. The monument is simple lists of names organized by regiment and date of death, carved in stone that will endure when memory fades. But the names tell story, the sheer number overwhelming, the ages young, the dates clustered in the major offensives when thousands died in single days. The silence is appropriate. There are no words adequate to the loss, no explanation that makes sense of the sacrifice, no meaning that redeems the suffering. The war that shattered innocence, the conflict that ended the long 19th century, the trenches where modern world was born in blood and mud and gas, and the recognition that humanity had created means of its own destruction. The war's consequences extended far beyond its ending, set stage for next war even more catastrophic, demonstrated that international system based on competing nation-states and alliance blocs could not prevent catastrophe, revealed that progress in technology without progress in wisdom leads not to utopia, but to unprecedented suffering. The innocence was lost, the confidence was shattered, and we remain inheritors of that loss, living in world shaped by the Great War, still struggling with the questions it raised about human nature and progress and civilization, still trying to build systems that can prevent such catastrophes while knowing that the capacity for such catastrophe remains within us. The war, forever shaping, forever warning, forever the hinge on which history turned. In the span of a single lifetime from 1920 to 2020, from the end of one world war to the beginning of a global pandemic, the world transformed more completely than in all previous history combined. The changes accelerated exponentially, compressed transformation that had previously required centuries into decades, then into years, then into the continuous flux that characterizes the present moment, where change is so constant that stability becomes anomaly rather than norm. We open in the acceleration, in the recognition that something fundamental has shifted in the relationship between human society and time. The grandparent born in 1920 experienced world of horse-drawn carriages and telegram communication, lived to see humans walk on moon, and communicate instantaneously across the globe. The change within single lifetime exceeded all the change from the invention of agriculture to the Industrial Revolution. And the acceleration continues. Each generation experiences more change than previous generation, adapts to transformations that are more radical and more rapid. The technologies multiply beyond capacity to fully integrate them. The atomic bomb arrives, gives humanity power to destroy itself completely, makes extinction a deliberate choice rather than inevitable fate, creates shadow under which all subsequent history unfolds. The computers arrive first room-sized machines that require teams of operators, then desktop devices, then smartphones more powerful than supercomputers of previous generation. The internet arrives connects humanity in ways that seem democratizing and liberating, until they prove to be also surveilling and manipulating and fragmenting. The genetic engineering arrives gives power to modify the code of life itself, to design organisms according to human specifications, to potentially redesign humans themselves through technologies that were science fiction when current generation was young. The artificial intelligence arrives creates systems that can defeat humans at any game, that can generate text and images and music indistinguishable from human creations, that may eventually possess capabilities that exceed human intelligence in every domain. The future that was supposed to arrive gradually arrived all at once, arrived too fast for adaptation, arrived before the ethical frameworks and social institutions and psychological capacities to manage it could develop. We can alter genes but do not know whether we should, can create artificial intelligence but cannot predict its consequences, can connect everyone but have not figured out how to prevent the connection from becoming tool of manipulation and control. The capability races ahead of wisdom. The power to act exceeds the understanding of what actions to take. We explore the vertigo of living in age of permanent revolution, where skills learned become obsolete before they are mastered, where career paths that seemed stable disappear, where the ground beneath us shifts constantly. The factory worker loses job to automation. The white-collar worker loses job to algorithm. The professional skills are replicated by artificial intelligence. And the adaptation required the constant retraining, the continuous adjustment, the endless flexibility demanded exceeds what many can provide. The connectivity that was supposed to bring understanding has brought fragmentation. The information abundance has brought confusion. The access to all human knowledge through devices in our pockets has not made us wiser but has made us overwhelmed, has drowned signal in noise, has made truth harder to discern because lies spread as easily as facts and outrage travels faster than nuance. We are more connected and more isolated simultaneously connected through screens, but isolated from embodied presence, connected to distant strangers but disconnected from neighbors, connected to information but disconnected from meaning. The environmental catastrophe approaches the climate crisis that industrial civilization created, that threatens the systems on which civilization depends, that will reshape human existence regardless of what actions are now taken, because the momentum of atmospheric change ensures decades of transformation that cannot be prevented. The crisis reveals both human power and human weakness: power to alter global climate through industrial activity, weakness to reverse the changes once they are underway, to coordinate action across nations and generations, to value future over present. The nuclear weapons persist: thousands of warheads capable of destroying human civilization, maintained at readiness, protected by systems that have failed hundreds of times without resulting in accidental launch, only through combinations of luck and last-minute human judgment. The possibility of human self-destruction through deliberate or accidental nuclear war remains real, remains present, remains risk that no amount of diplomatic effort has eliminated. The artificial intelligence threatens to become uncontrollable systems whose functioning their creators cannot fully explain, whose goals might diverge from human goals, whose capabilities might eventually exceed human capabilities, to the point where human oversight becomes meaningless. The existential risk that artificial intelligence poses is debated, but the risk is not zero, and the trajectory suggests that machines capable of autonomous action and self-improvement are approaching whether humanity is ready or not. The chapter deepens into reflection on what it means to be human in an age when human meaning and purpose are uncertain. If machines can think, what does human thinking mean? If genes can be edited, what does natural human mean? If virtual experience rivals physical experience, what does real mean? The categories that seemed solid, the distinctions between natural and artificial, between human and machine, between real and simulated, are dissolving, are becoming questions rather than givens. We close standing at threshold of futures that are simultaneously utopian and dystopian, understanding that same technologies that promise to solve every problem also threaten to create problems we cannot imagine. The artificial intelligence could bring abundance or could bring subjugation. The genetic engineering could eliminate disease or could create new inequalities based on genetic enhancement. The climate crisis could force cooperation and innovation or could cause collapse and conflict. The future is not determined, is still being created through choices made too quickly for full consideration, made under pressures that prevent careful deliberation, made in hope or fear or desperation. The future that arrived too soon. The transformation that outpaced adaptation. The age of miracles and terrors that we inhabit but do not yet comprehend. The becoming continues faster than ever, continues in directions that cannot be predicted, continues whether we are ready or not. We are passengers more than pilots, reacting more than directing, caught in acceleration that we initiated but that now carries us forward with momentum that cannot be stopped. The future unfolds. The changes multiply. The acceleration continues. And we continue forward carrying the inheritance of all previous generations, carrying the capabilities and the problems that modernity has created, carrying the uncertainty about what comes next, knowing only that there is no stopping, no returning to simpler times, no escape from the future we have summoned. The threshold ahead, the transformation ongoing, forever becoming, forever uncertain, forever the species that changed itself too fast to understand what it was becoming, that gave itself powers that gods were supposed to possess, that arrived at the future before determining what the future should be. The future, forever arriving too soon, forever demanding more than we can give, forever the challenge that defines us even as it overwhelms us. Conclusion, and so we arrive at the end of our journey through time, though endings, like beginnings, are arbitrary markings we place on processes that know no natural boundaries. We have walked backward from the present moment through all the layers of human history, through all the transformations that made us what we are, back to the origins in the dust of ancient Africa, where the first uncertain steps were taken, where the first tools were shaped, where the first flames were captured. The journey has shown us that humanity is not fixed state, but is continuous becoming, continuous transformation, continuous evolution that has no predetermined direction and no final destination. We are not finished products but are works in progress, are not at the end of development but are in the middle of story whose conclusion cannot be predicted. We learned that the transformations that made us human came with costs. The upright walking brought freed hands but brought difficult childbirth. The tools extended capability but created dependency. The fire brought warmth but brought destruction. The language enabled communication but enabled deception. The agriculture brought abundance but brought servitude. The writing preserved knowledge but killed oral traditions. The empires brought order but brought oppression. The machines brought wealth but brought degradation. Each transformation was bargain trading certain goods for other goods, accepting costs in exchange for benefits, moving forward without full knowledge of where forward would lead. We learned that human history is not simple story of progress, is not linear march from ignorance to knowledge, from barbarism to civilization, from suffering to flourishing. is instead complex movement that goes backward and forward simultaneously, that creates new problems while solving old ones, that brings both gains and losses in every transformation. The hunter-gatherers were healthier than early farmers. The pre-industrial workers had more leisure than industrial workers. The gains are real, but so are the losses, and honest accounting requires acknowledging both. We learned that humans have tremendous power and terrible vulnerability, have power to reshape the earth, to alter the climate, to create weapons that can destroy civilization, to modify the code of life itself, but have vulnerability to disease, to environmental catastrophe, to the unintended consequences of our own technologies, to the failure of the complex systems on which modern life depends. The power and the vulnerability are both greater than ever, are both increasing as technologies become more potent and interdependencies become deeper. We learned that human achievements are fragile. The empires fall, the civilizations collapse, the knowledge is lost. The continuity that seems solid can break suddenly when conditions change. The ruins teach humility, teach that what seems permanent is temporary, that what seems secure can crumble, that every human creation carries within it the seeds of its own dissolution. But we also learned about human resilience. The catastrophes are survived. The civilizations rebuild. The knowledge is rediscovered or created anew. Through plagues and wars and collapses, through all the disasters that punctuate human history, humans persist, adapt, and survive and create and build again. The resilience is remarkable, is testimony to human capacity to endure suffering and to continue despite suffering. The evening has deepened now into full night. The journey backward through time has brought us full circle from present to past and back to present, from the familiar world to the strange origins and forward to the uncertain future. The history we have traveled was never simply about the past, was always about understanding what we are by understanding what we were, about seeing the present moment as point in longer trajectory, about recognizing that we are not separate from history but are part of history, are the latest chapter in story that began millions of years ago and that continues through us. Rest now. Let the journey settle into sleep's embrace. Let the weight of deep time become something lighter, not burden but connection, not distance but intimacy. You are linked to every human who came before through unbroken chain of ancestors, are inheritor of all the transformations, all the achievements, all the sufferings and survivals that brought humanity from then to now. Carry within you the DNA of ancestors who survived impossible odds. carry the cultural inheritance of all the knowledge and art and wisdom that humans have accumulated. The footprints walk through time from the first steps on ancient savanna to your steps today. The tools extend from the first stone flakes to the technologies you use. The fire burns from the first captured flames to the energy systems that power modern life. The words flow from the first attempts at speech to the languages you speak. The seeds grow from the first plantings to the agriculture that feeds you. The stories continue from the first tales told around ancient fires to the narratives that shape your understanding. And you carry it all forward, are not endpoint but are continuation, are not finished but are becoming. Stand on threshold always between past and future, between what we were and what we will become, between the certainty of where we have been and the uncertainty of where we are going. Sleep now. Dream of ancestors who walked before you, who struggled and survived, who created and destroyed, who passed forward the life that became your life. Dream of the long journey from ape to human to whatever comes next. Dream of the becoming that has no ending because we are always becoming, are never finished, are always threshold between what was and what will be. The journey continues in your dreams. The story has no ending because you are part of it. You are the latest sentence in narrative that began millions of years ago, our inheritor of all that came before, our creator of what comes next. Are the human present carrying the past forward, shaping the future through choices you make, standing in the eternal now where history is always being made? Rest well. The journey of tonight is complete, but the larger journey, the journey of humanity through time, that journey continues. Continues through you. Continues in ways you cannot predict. Continues because being human means continuing, means persisting, means carrying forward the light that was captured so long ago and that must be tended still. Good night. Sleep deep, and when you wake, remember you are human, our inheritor of millions of years of evolution, our carrier of accumulated wisdom and accumulated folly, our participant in the long experiment of consciousness trying to understand itself, our threshold creature standing between past and future, our becoming, always becoming, forever. The ancestors watch over your sleep. The deep time holds you gently. The long journey from then to now culminates in this moment, this quiet moment where you rest, where the history settles, where the transformation continues in silence, where you, inheritor of everything, rest before continuing the journey that has no end. Sleep now. The history is complete for tonight, but the making of history continues, and you are part of it, forever participant, forever inheritor, forever creator, forever human. The journey continues, in dreams, in tomorrow, in all the tomorrows that will come. The becoming continues, and you are the becoming, the latest expression of the process that began in African dust and that continues still, that will continue through you and through all who follow, that has no ending because evolution has no ending, because transformation is endless, because becoming is what being human means. Good night, dream deep. The story continues forever, and you are the story, forever becoming, forever human, forever part of the long journey that is not yet complete and will never be complete because completion would mean the end of change and change has no ending. Rest now. The journey waits for morning, but tonight rest, dream, and in dreaming carry forward all that came before into all that will come after. The end that is not ending, the rest that prepares for continuation, the sleep that holds the waking to come. Forever.